Hollis Phelps. Welcome to Politics Done Right, my friend. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I currently teach at Mercer University and Penfield College in the Department of Liberal Studies. And prior to that, I taught in the Department of Religion at the University of Mount Olive. And, I have a PhD in religious studies, and I also do work in philosophy and philosophy of religion. But a lot of my writing and research focuses on the intersection of religion and politics and culture in the United States, but also globally in terms of debt. So
I think that is so important, because as I mentioned to you offline, when I come out here, and as much as I grew up a Christian, and as much as I was a lot into religion before I became a humanist, it doesn't have the gravitas as somebody who has studied it in detail. And having you on the program, deconstructing what we have with white evangelicals, it makes it that much more important for our viewership to hear. So why don't you tell me, first of all, who are these white evangelicals?
Well, white evangelicals are a huge portion of the population in the United States, and politically speaking, they're a very influential voting bloc. And so, especially as you saw in this last election, if you can get white evangelicals, if you can get their vote as a whole, you're not going to get every vote, of course, but if you can get their vote as a whole, then you can really swing a presidential election. And I think that if white evangelicals hadn't lined up behind Donald Trump, then Donald Trump wouldn't be president. I think he knew that going in, and he played it to his favor. And so white evangelicals are in large measure responsible for electing Donald Trump to the presidency.
Now, you made an interesting point in your article, and what I think is important about your article is that you don't fall into the trap that somehow Donald Trump made these guys. I think in your article you pointed out that these guys were in existence long before, and not only that, but their ideology and their seeking of power has always been there. So why don't you elaborate some on that?
Well, what we have with Donald Trump isn't a new phenomenon. And I think that if you could sort of read the writing on the wall, it wasn't surprising that they lined up behind Donald Trump. White evangelicals in the United States, at least the way I read them, they constitute primarily a political movement. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that religion and politics are never separate entities. And we have to read them politically in that sense as well. And at least since the moral majority, though I think you can trace it back before that as well, white evangelicals in the United States have wanted power, and they have a very particular vision of what the United States should look like. And for them, that should be a Christian nation, in quotation marks, I should put that. And for them, that means a very conservative nation with very conservative social values and policies that reflect those values. And Donald Trump, in that sense, gave them precisely what they wanted. They're not interested in electing a moral figure who's going to be some sort of moral exemplar that they can pattern their lives after. They're interested in someone who is going to give them what they want. And what they want, at least this time around on my reading, is so-called religious freedom, which is just a euphemism for denying certain people their rights. And they're also looking long-term at stacking the courts, especially the Supreme Court. They see vacancies, and they see vacancies opening up during Trump's administration. And that's the game they're playing. It's political calculation, but the movement is, I would say, precisely based on political calculation.
So, in other words, I want to do two things. I want to read you an excerpt from your article, but also
Sure.
I think there's something that you're saying in that they want to stack the courts, etc. The courts, I think, is the only department or the only part of our government which is only democratic at the time of appointment, but after appointment, it is no longer democratic. It
Right.
is a freewheeling part of our government. The separation of powers really isn't that it really isn't that fair between the three branches of government. Now, you said the following: Evangelicals put great stock in the Bible, but as others have noted in the Trump context, the Bible is full of stories of God choosing morally ambiguous and even repulsive individuals to lead the so-called faithful. Indeed, that narrative line, repeated over again in numerous ways, make up a significant portion of what most Christians refer to as the Old Testament. Another way to put that, the matter is to say that the Bible isn't all about love, and how you relate to your neighbor, as Christians of a more liberal bent seem to assume privately and then and when they enter the public sphere. Are you also saying that, in effect, these guys are saying the Bible give them a right to be evil at times?
I don't know if I would put it precisely in those terms, but I think that they would recognize at least a right to some sort of moral ambiguity. Which some people might want to label as evil. I mean, as I say in the piece, and I'll go ahead and state it here, I'm not an evangelical, and if I had to throw my hat in with someone, it would be liberal Christians. But I think where liberal Christians go wrong is they tend to reduce the biblical narratives to this narrative of love that culminates in the person of Jesus. And the problem with that is that the Bible is way more complex than that. There are numerous narrative lines in the Bible. They don't all adhere together into some neat and tidy whole. And the Bible, yes, has portions that are about love, but there are also portions about political calculation, about some figure who we might want to label as evil, rising up to deliver God's people. I mean, if you just look at the narrative, I always think of the person Samson. Right, in the book of Judges. I mean, Samson's held to be this great, outstanding individual. And even if you look at kids' Bibles, he's pictured as a strong, muscular person that children should emulate and so on and so forth. But if you read his story, he's a horrible individual. He lies, he cheats, he commits genocide. He's not someone you would want to hold up as a moral example. Yet, according to the narrative, he does God's will. And so there is in the Bible some sort of support for this line of thinking. I'm not saying I agree with that line of thinking. I don't. But there is some sort of support. So I think it's wrong to just dismiss evangelicals as being unbiblical in their support for Donald Trump, as a lot of liberal Christians tend to do. I think that misses the ambiguity of the Bible itself, but also the ambiguity of politics.
It's interesting because I've always spoken about the Bible, parts of the Bible being, when people, I'm a humanist, so I don't, a Christian turned humanist. So I listen to all sides. And when people were attacking the Quran, what I told them is, hey, the Bible have parts that,
exactly,
that looks similar to the Quran. Now, the thing about it is, I knew that, but somehow I never internalized that in my in my confrontations with, let's say, the right. And after reading your piece, that is immediately what hit me. It almost codified that, come on, progressives, come on, liberals. The argument against these people cannot be they're not being biblical, because, in fact, they can show a portion of what they're doing as being biblical. And I think that is what was so resounding in your piece, because you looked at it objectively from 1,000 feet up, and people were able to see, wait a minute, that is the reason why we can't get to them. That's the reason why they're so immutable. So, first of all, I want to thank you for that piece. What I want to ask you, oh yeah, go ahead, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'm glad that resonated with you, because that's one of the main things that I wanted to do with the piece, and I've written about it in a few other pieces as well, is that you can't just dismiss this line as unbiblical. But I would also add, I think it's unfortunate that we're in a political situation where we constantly have to justify things in terms of the Bible. And so I think that's a problem too, and we shouldn't have to do that. If people want to, that's fine, but we shouldn't constantly have to go back to is this biblical or not, to try to make political arguments.
Exactly, because it's biblical, it's Quranical, it's whatever.
Right.
What do they call the laws from the Quran again?
Sharia.
Yeah. The thing about it is, you're right. I think you capture that perfectly, and that is, we shouldn't have to go back to some moral book or religious book to determine what we as people know are best for humans or best for the citizens of our country. We should just know something is good or has great outcomes, or they don't. And
that doesn't mean we can't glean any sort of insight out of these texts. I think we can, but we're also living in a completely different context than they were written in. So,
you opened up a little can of worms by saying that, because the same way you say that about the Bible is the same way I constantly talk when we are trying to push certain parts of our progressive agenda. Is the same thing I push about the Constitution. These items were written in different times, so we cannot verbatim follow these guys. I think the Supreme Court did great jobs at times when they actually got the spirit of the Constitution, but not the letter of the Constitution, with regards to several policies out there. So let me ask you then, where do we go from here? What do you think? For progressives, how should they mitigate the problem that is, at this point in our history, the what I would call the evangelical problem?
I would first say I don't think you can argue with evangelicals over this. And I don't think you can label them as hypocrites or anything like that. That's the normal strategy that's taken. That was the strategy that was taken by 95% of the pieces written about evangelicals following Donald Trump. They were called hypocrites for supporting Trump, and so on and so forth. The problem is that no one views themselves as a hypocrite, and so the charge is sort of empty. But I think you, in a way, have to play their own game. And what I mean by that is that evangelicals and the right in general, I think, are really good at garnering support and stirring up people's emotions. And Donald Trump played on that. I mean, I know it's common to label Donald Trump as someone who's not very bright and unhinged and so on and so forth. But I think on his part, that's all calculated. He knows who he's playing to, and he knows how to win their emotional favor. And whether we like it or not, politics is based in large measure on that emotional response. And I think progressives need to learn from that we need to have candidates that appeal emotionally to people, that are charismatic in that sense. And I think we also have to recognize that politics is a fight. Politics isn't all about getting along and coming to some sort of middle ground. Politics is about asserting your position. And that's what evangelicals have been doing for a very long time, and the right in general have been doing for a very long time, and they've been successful at doing that. And so I think that if we really, progressives really agree with the policies that we think are good for everyone, then we have to fight hard like that as well, and not sort of cede that ground, and recognize that politics is conflictual at its very nature, and the Democrats just haven't been good at that, and they're not being good at it right now either. They're about to fall into the same trap as they did in the last election. And if they don't take the right seriously, and if they don't take Donald Trump and his supporters seriously and how they play the game in that sense, they will lose again.
Dr. Hollis Phelps, I can't think of a better way to end this segment. Those are words progressives, those are words Democrats better listen to. Thank you so kindly for having been.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Have a great day now.
Thanks, you too.